Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Jalal Dahham will defend the academic thesis, Economic Burden of Multiple Sclerosis in Low and Middle-Income Countries, a case study from Lebanon. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and a conclusion of your thesis, please.
Thank you, highly esteemed Prorector. Dear Prorector, members of the Corona, colleagues, friends, and family, now I will present the main findings of my dissertation, Economic Burden of Multiple Sclerosis in Low and Middle-Income Countries, a case study from Lebanon. Multiple sclerosis is an inflammatory disease of the central nervous system that affects 2.8 million people worldwide. It's the leading cause of non-traumatic disability in young adults. The cause of MS is still unknown. However, genetic and environmental factors are believed to trigger the disease. MS symptoms disrupt the quality of life and productivity of MS patients and affect their families and friends, resulting in a huge economic burden. There is no cure for MS. Available medication reduce the risk of relapses and slow down disease progression, and these are known to be expensive medications. While MS progression differs from person to person, disability is routinely measured with the Expanded Disability Status Scale to assess the degree of impairment in neurological functions. EDSS scores 0 to 3 indicate mild MS, 4 to 6.5 moderate MS, and 7 to 9 severe MS. Cost and health utilities are highly dependent on EDSS scores. This dissertation focuses on health technology assessment. Decision makers need to determine which health interventions to adopt for optimal allocation of scarce resources, including multiple sclerosis, among other chronic illnesses. And this could be achieved through health technology assessment. Economic burden and economic evaluation studies are important pillars of health technology assessment. Cost of illness and health-related quality of life describes the economic burden of a health problem and provide input for economic evaluation studies. Economic evaluation studies assess the consumption of health resources and health benefits for a health intervention in comparison with other health technologies in order to choose the most appropriate and efficient one. Economic evaluation guidelines are mainly used by high-income countries to guide the performance of economic evaluation studies. While many high-income countries have well-established economic evaluation guidelines, little is known about the status and content of these guidelines in low-middle-income countries, where health resources are even more scarce, necessitating their efficient allocation. Although the economic burden of multiple sclerosis is well studied in high-income countries, information in low-middle-income countries remains scarce, and the quality of existing studies is questionable in the absence of local health economics guidelines. Moreover, the increased prevalence of multiple sclerosis in low-middle-income countries warrants more health economics guidelines and health economic studies to understand the burden on their societies. To date, there has been no comprehensive overview of the status and content of economic evaluation guidelines, nor a systematic review compiling evidence on the economic burden of multiple sclerosis in low and middle-income countries. There are no health economics guidelines for reporting and conducting cost of illness and health-related quality of life, nor guidelines for the evaluation of costs in low middle-income countries. Thus, addressing the need for research in these areas using the previously unexplored economic burden of multiple sclerosis in Lebanon in terms of cost of illness and health-related quality of life provided the rationale and objectives of this dissertation. Various methods were used in this dissertation, including systematic reviews, a study protocol, a guide for valuing costs, which were used in conducting cost of illness and health-related quality of life studies. We started this research by conducting 2 systematic reviews on the economic evaluation guidelines and economic burden of multiple sclerosis in low and middle-income countries. In both guidelines, we followed the PRISMA in both systematic reviews, we followed the PRISMA guidelines for conducting and reporting on a systematic review. In the first systematic review, we provided a comparative analysis in order to investigate which countries have economic evaluation guidelines and explore similarities and differences in their content. Our results revealed 13 economic evaluation guidelines in low-middle income and upper-middle income countries without evidence of the development of these guidelines in low-income countries. Many methodological gaps were identified in these guidelines pertaining to the study perspective, type of cost, time horizon, uncertainty, and sensitivity analysis. Awareness of the identified methodological gaps informs international organization in guiding low-middle income countries to develop their economic evaluation guidelines and improve the methodological framework of existing ones. In the second systematic review, we provided a descriptive qualitative and quantitative analysis and critically appraised methodologies used. We identified 14 cost of illness studies, all of which were conducted in upper-middle income economies. Many methodological differences were found between the studies, which led to substantial variations in terms of absolute costs. The mean annual costs per patient increased with greater disease severity. MS medications are the main cost driver in mild MS, whereas the proportion of direct non-medical cost and indirect cost dominates in moderate and severe MS. Although we found substantial variations in absolute cost, the cost ratio between different EDSS levels were relatively stable, making comparison feasible. In the absence of health economics guidelines, we developed a study protocol to assess the economic and societal burden of multiple sclerosis in Lebanon by MS severity levels. The study protocol serves as a guide in designing, conducting, and reporting on an economic burden of illness in a low-middle income country. We enrolled 210 Lebanese patients aged 18 years and older who had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis for more than 6 months. We collected information through a face-to-face validated questionnaire, and this study was conducted in collaboration with a premier MS center in Lebanon at the American University of Beirut Medical Center. We published the questionnaire used in the study, which could be used to perform cost of illness studies in other countries, provided it's adapted to the illness and the country's own healthcare system. The questionnaire requests information on demographic characteristics, disease data, healthcare and service consumption, formal and informal care, workforce participation, and health utilities value. Included costs were categorized as direct medical costs, direct non-medical costs, and indirect costs related to reduced productivity. In the absence of local costing data, we discussed steps on how to get a valid valuation of cost during financial and economic crises using the case of Lebanon. At the beginning of 2019, we embarked on a study of the economic burden of multiple sclerosis in Lebanon. A few months later, since October 2019, Lebanon has been trapped in a triple disaster: an unprecedented economic and financial crisis compounded by COVID-19 pandemic and the explosion of Beirut's port that devastated the country's capital. Lebanon was an upper middle income economy for 25 years and moved to the category of lower middle income in 2022. The annual GDP plummeted from $55 billion in 2018 to less than $20 billion in 2022, and the average annual inflation for the year 2022 reached more than 200%. The currency lost more than 95% of its value between 2019 and 2022. Thus, the prevailing crises made the valuation of costs very challenging. Meanwhile, studying the economic burden of multiple sclerosis in Lebanon is extremely relevant considering the increased prevalence of multiple sclerosis within a decade. We provided empirical recommendations that are particularly relevant in low-middle income countries in periods characterized by hyperinflation, where economic crises and recessions are recurrent phenomena. These technical recommendations include transparent reporting and justification of methodologies and approaches used, collecting the prices of each resources from multiple and various sources, and clearly referencing and validating data with key informant interviews, conducting sensitivity analyses, adjusting costs for inflation collected during different periods of fluctuating prices, and reporting costs in local currency and in international US dollar purchasing power parity. Thereafter, we assess the societal cost of multiple sclerosis in Lebanon following the aforementioned recommendations. We included all costs for regardless of who bore them. Considering the soaring inflation and the gradual lifting of subsidies, we conducted a sensitivity analysis or two scenario analyses in which we calculated all costs for the year 2021 based on the average market price before and after subsidies were lifted. We report high total annual costs per patient, which is around 33,000 US dollar purchasing power parity for the year 2021, 12.4 times higher than the nominal GDP per capita. The mean annual costs per patient for the sensitivity analysis in Lebanese pound in scenario 1 increased up to 2.5 times in scenario 2 after subsidies were lifted, which is equivalent with the rate of hyperinflation in Lebanon. The total annual costs per patient increase with greater disease severity. MS medications are the main cost driver in mild MS, whereas the proportion of productivity losses dominates in moderate and severe MS. We concluded this research by assessing the health-related quality of life and utilities among Lebanese patients using the Eurocall, which is a generic quality of life instrument, and the MS-specific quality of life instrument, the music call. Both quality of life instruments generate health state utilities where 0 is death and 1 is perfect health. The mean Eurocall and music call utility scores decrease as MS progresses. We show that higher education level, longer disease duration, and lower EDSS scores are associated significantly with a higher Eurocall utility, while employment, less cognitive difficulties, and lower EDSS scores are associated with a better music call utility. In summary, economic burden of multiple sclerosis and economic evaluation guidelines are unexplored in low-income countries, and existing studies in low-middle-income countries and guidelines are limited and underdeveloped. In the absence of local health economics guidelines, the study protocol is crucial. The country-specific context should be clearly reported and considered in the interpretation of results. The economic burden of multiple sclerosis in low-middle-income countries, including Lebanon, is huge, and the mean annual costs increase with greater disease severity. Quality of life of Lebanese patients deteriorated as MS progressed. As part of this research, conducting a systematic review in health economics and interpreting its result is challenging, specifically in low-middle-income countries in the absence of health economics guidelines. Another challenge is the absence of essential elements for health technology assessment research and health economics guidelines in Lebanon, including a manual for costing and quality of life tariff values. The increased pressure on scarce resources, specifically in the context of the prevailing crises, warrants implementing health technology assessment guidelines in Lebanon to efficiently allocate resources in compliance with budget constraints. Thank you. I will give back the word to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Pavlova, Professor of Health Economics and Equity of Maastricht University, and she was also the chair of the assessment committee. Professor Pavlova.
Dear candidate, my congratulations to you and to your supervisory team for this important work and for your dissertation focused on economic burden of multiple sclerosis in low and middle income countries. The topic is relevant and very much up to date, and your dissertation for sure provides evidence that will be of great value for decision makers and researchers in Lebanon, which is your specific context, but also for researchers in other low and middle income countries, because as we've seen, there are not so many studies and economic evaluation guidelines in this region. Your general introduction chapter is very well written, and it offers a very comprehensive overview of the medical condition and also of the context. But I could not understand why you have selected those specific objectives. So why those 4 objectives, how they will help you to achieve the aim, why you think that they can help you to achieve the aim in a comprehensive manner? And did you use any framework to select, or maybe you have any other reason for those objectives? So I would like to hear more about your motivation.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the compliments and thank you for your question. So actually we started with a background research by studying the economic burden of multiple sclerosis and the economic evaluation guidelines without limiting our search to low-middle income countries. And at the time, we found that there are little studies in low-middle income countries and little guidelines. And also, we found that in the absence of local health economics guidelines in low-middle income countries, some researchers are using international guidelines in their studies without accounting for the contextual factor, which will lead for some bias. And once we found that there are these 4 there is a lag, then we framed our hypothesis around studying the economic burden of multiple sclerosis and the economic evaluation guidelines in low-middle income countries, and using Lebanon as a case study, and at the same time to explore the economic burden of multiple sclerosis in Lebanon previously unexplored.
Thank you. I think this clarifies a little bit more about why those objectives. But I was wondering, those objectives, they lead to very much quantitative empirical results. So I was wondering whether you are able to see all the nuances behind the numbers by simply having quantitative studies. So imagine you have a possibility to have a grant to do qualitative exploration. Which kind of factors which kind of topics you would like to explore, because maybe you are not able to quantify them, but you think that they will be important to understand better the problem?
So while we started in our research, the first part by conducting 2 systematic reviews. The first one was qualitative analysis to explore the economic evaluation guidelines in low-middle income countries, where we provided what are the similarities and differences between countries. In the second systematic review, it was a combination of qualitative and quantitative analysis. In the second part, in the absence of local health economics guidelines, we discussed normative bases and theoretical on how to get a high-quality economic burden of multiple sclerosis in a low-middle, or a high quality of economic burden of illness in a low-middle income country, and we focused on the case of Lebanon. In the last part, while we presented our data with a quantitative analysis, the quantitative analysis was completed with a qualitative analysis in the discussion in order to understand the underlying patterns within data, explaining the results, and also the country-specific context. So it's a mixture between quantitative and qualitative analysis, because in the discussion also we wanted to explain how the severe economic crises in Lebanon or the triple disaster affected our results.
Okay, thank you for this explanation. I was more wondering if you can do a qualitative study, what kind of topics you would like to include, something that you are not able to explore in the quantitative analysis, but you think that was important, could have helped you to understand better the problem that you study.
And you mean the problem in terms of economic burden of multiple sclerosis?
The burden of
Multiple sclerosis
yes.
in Lebanon or in low middle income countries?
In Lebanon.
In Lebanon. I would definitely in the future look to factors associated with or study the factors associated like cultural, physical, and psychological well-being factors associated with quality of life, because in the last chapter where we assessed the quality of life of MS patients in Lebanon, we looked to clinical, demographic, and socioeconomic variables. So I would in the future look to this kind of variables to see like how they will influence quality of life in Lebanon.
Yeah, thank you very much for this explanation. I also think that even if you can do such a study, which will be very interesting continuation of your work, there will be always some restrictions because for contextual factors, you might not be able to find certain information. Like I was wondering, do you think you are able to capture all cost information in your study, or you think because of the specific context there were some costs that you are not able to include, but you think that could be relevant for Lebanon?
Yeah. So despite the fact that we don't have guidelines for health economics in Lebanon, we accounted for all costs for regardless of who bore them. And usually the societal perspective, which is the preferred perspective by economists, one of the barriers to adopt this perspective in low middle income countries is a lack of local costing data and a data collection tool. However, in our study, we tried our best to include all costs, but that said, we face some limitation. So the first limitation can be that we annualize cost with the assumption that there was no quarterly variation in consumption of healthcare resources and cost, and specifically during periods of economic crises and after periods of lockdown, which could lead to bias. The second one, that in the absence of local national data, we estimated some costs, such as the average national wage and the cost for informal care. And specifically to answer your question, the third limitation was that although we accounted for all costs, but considering the financial turmoil in the Lebanese market, it was difficult to reflect accurately all costs, and including black market cost and the fully subsidized cost by the central bank at that time. But these were considered as a minor cost, not a major cost, because the major cost for MS were the DMTs, the cost for the DMTs, and productivity losses, and they were like both well reflected in our study.
Thank you very much for the detailed answer.
Yeah.
I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you, Professor Pavlova. The opposition will be continued by Professor Groot, Professor of Health Economics, Maastricht University. Professor Groot.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, I've read your dissertation with great interest, and I want to take the opportunity to express my appreciation for the work that you've done. I think your study makes an important contribution to an understudied area, the economic evaluation in low and middle income countries, and more specifically on the cost of illness for multiple sclerosis. In that sense, I think your work is important and fills a gap in our knowledge on this topic. So I want to congratulate you with that achievement. Of course, with all interesting and important contributions also raises questions, and I would like to take the opportunity to discuss with you some of your results in Chapter 2 of your dissertation. In Chapter 2, you review the literature on the economic evaluation guidelines in low and middle income country. And maybe not completely to my surprise, you find very few economic guidelines in these countries. You found only 13 of these. And that raises the question why there are so few of these. What might be the reason for that? Now I want to propose to you some potential reasons for that, and I would like to invite you to reflect a bit on that. One potential explanation is, of course, that these countries simply don't have the resources to conduct studies in this area. That might be true. On the other hand, you can also say, why don't these countries just copy and adapt guidelines from other countries? Why do they have to develop their own guidelines in this if they don't have the resources for that? Now, in my opinion, I think a much more important reason for this lack of guidelines is simply that they're not so much needed in these countries. Economic guidelines or economic evaluation are typically done in settings where there is public decision-making about resource allocation, including public decision-making about allocation of resources for healthcare. Now, in low and middle-income countries, the healthcare systems are frequently or almost always underfunded, which means that they only can finance the basic necessities in the system, and that would also mean that there's not really very much need to decide about how to spend it. You just spend it on the basics. Secondly, in many countries, a large part of healthcare spending is out-of-pocket spending, either formally or informally, and that means that it's mostly up to a patient's ability to pay, and of course their preference to allocate resources to that. Whether or not they use healthcare, and that also makes that it's not so really necessary to have economic evaluation about the cost effectiveness on that. So from a public spending allocation point of view, it may not really be necessary to have economic evaluation. Secondly, the second reason why you do economic evaluation is, basically it's for new innovative forms of treatments. And technologies or pharmaceuticals. Also in many of these countries are not among the first to introduce these innovative forms of treatment, basically because the underfunding of the system doesn't allow them to do that. So my conjecture is that the reason why you find so very few guidelines on this is simply because the context, the setting is such that there's not much use for economic evaluation in these countries. Now, I would welcome your reflections and your perspective on this.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the compliments and thank you for your question. They are not used, but doesn't mean that there is no need for them, because the need would be to allocate resources in compliance with budget constraints. And when we talk about low-middle income countries, we talk about countries that are lacking the essential elements for in the structure of the healthcare sector, lacking universal coverage, having inequalities in allocation of data of their health resources, but at the same time, like these countries are also suffering from like this inequality, leading not everyone is accessing healthcare at the right moment. So lack of resources, yes, and this was one of the generated direction for future research from our studies that we suggest to explore the reason behind like the lack of economic evaluation guidelines in low-middle income countries, but also political dilemmas and decision-making could be also a reason to delay the implementation of economic evaluation guidelines. The healthcare expenditure in low-middle income countries are higher than high-income countries, and at the same time, the economic burden on in some illnesses and diseases is higher in low-middle income countries compared to high-income countries, because one of the recommendations of the study was to present the cost or the direct cost in terms of economic indicators. And for instance, when we said in Lebanon, the cost of multiple sclerosis was 12.4 times than the nominal GDP per capita, this cost, if we want to compare it to the cost for severe MS patient in the Netherlands, this 1.2
Now that's an interesting point indeed. Maybe you can use economic evaluations to emphasize the importance of allocating more resources and to make people more aware of the importance and the cost of illness or the burden of illness of a disease. And as you mentioned, maybe the cost of illness in Lebanon is relatively higher than in the Netherlands or other European countries. But that raises the question you mentioned in your in the previous discussion that there are no guidelines in Lebanon. What would the availability of guidelines in Lebanon actually change in the allocation of resources for treatment of multiple sclerosis, in your opinion?
So having a guidelines will guide the conducting of economic evaluation studies, and all available studies, they will be following the same guidelines. That's mean like comparability within studies will be enhanced, and at the same time, this having a guidelines, that means they will be also accounted for the local contextual factors, because you mentioned in your earlier question about why they don't copy and adapt.
But what in practice would be the difference of having guidelines? Would it mean there is more money allocated to treatment of multiple sclerosis? Would it mean that there would be more money available for healthcare in general?
No, but this will be about efficiently allocating resources in compliance with budget constraints, like based on the need and based on the available budget. So in high-income countries, you have more budget available, while in low-income countries, middle-income countries, if you have limited budget, so it helps to have some sort of economic evaluation guidelines to guide, like
helps in exactly in what sense then?
In order to study the cost effectiveness and the efficiency of interventions in terms of use for the population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Okay, now, thanks for your response. I give the word back to the pro-rector.
Thank you, Professor Groot. The opposition will be continued by Professor Salameh, from Professor of Epidemiology of INSPECT, of the Institute INSPECT of the Lebanese University. Professor Salameh is online. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, dear candidate, for your excellent presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I also enjoyed reading your manuscript, and I think that you did a very good job. You did a comprehensive work, and you were able to really tackle many aspects of the multiple sclerosis economic constraints that could be really faced by low-middle income countries, particularly Lebanon. Now, based on the work that you did, actually, I have a couple of questions for you. My first question is of methodological nature, and here I would like to ask you, if you had an unlimited fund for your study, particularly for the chapter 4 of your work, where you had to go and do an epidemiological study in front of patients. So what would you change? How can you improve your study? You did a cross-sectional study. So can you improve that? Can you change the method? Can you change the sample? Can you change the measurements that were done?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments. And regarding chapter 4, which is about the study protocol, when we did the study protocol was in the absence of health economics guidelines and based on the drastic situations that existed in Lebanon. But definitely, if in the future I will have the chance, maybe I will have like a more long-term study in order to examine how the differences in the Lebanese context when it comes to the prevailing crises and specifically the financial and the economic crises, how it affected the consumption of health resources and cost for patient. So as you know, we did a sensitivity analysis for the year 2021 based on the average market price before and after subsidies were lifted. So maybe I will have like a longer study in order to see how the consumption of health resources and associated costs and as well as quality of life are changing from year to year based on the contextual factor of Lebanon.
Okay, thank you. So what you are suggesting is a prospective study where you have a better intake into account of other factors that could change with time. And I guess that this would really improve the quality of any work that can be done. Doing a prospective study is always better than doing a cross-sectional one. Now, you mentioned something about your sensitivity analysis. And I saw throughout your manuscript that you talked a little bit about the access to medication. You mentioned the shortage in medication that was due to the severe socioeconomic crisis. But I could not locate how you took into account the shortage of medication in your analysis. And I would like to ask you whether you think that the medication shortage would affect a future analysis that you might do, and how it can affect it, and how it can affect the cost, the future cost of the disease if there is a medication shortage, and particularly whenever we have the smuggling of medication. Sometimes it could be falsified. They could be substandard medications that would be on the market, and that sometimes some patients who have difficulties in accessing high quality medication would go for a lower cost. So how do you think that all this context could affect your future analysis, let's say?
Yeah. A recent study that was published this summer about the barriers of accessing disease-modifying therapies in Middle East and North Africa shed lights on the disparity between these countries when it comes to access to DMTs, and that the main barrier is the cost of DMTs. And this was linked to the gross national income. And the findings of the studies are consistent with what we found in our study, because when we conducted the data collection, it was still at that time that most of the medication or disease-modifying therapies were subsidized from the central bank in Lebanon. So DMTs were available at that time, which is not the case. So we address this in our study, but we address it as an implication for clinical researcher, because we know at that time, after we concluded our data collections, that the DMTs are not available anymore. And I mean that our findings are consistent with the studies that showed that there is a high connectivity and relationship with gross national income, because when Lebanon was an upper middle income economy, those DMTs existed in the market. However, when Lebanon moved to the category of lower middle income country, like these DMTs are not available anymore, and they are using off-label medication. However, talking about like how this could affect definitely the lack of DMTs, since DMTs they extend or they delay the progression of MS and reduce the risk of relapses. So like the lack of DMTs will increase other costs, perhaps include the costs related to productivity losses and non-direct medical costs, example, cost of informal care and formal care and hospitalization and other costs not included.
Okay, thank you, dear candidate, Mr. President, thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Jongen, neurologist from the Multiple Sclerosis Research Institute in Nijmegen and University of Groningen. Dr. Jongen.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, my compliments for your thesis that is both detailed and extensive. I must say I read your thesis with very special interest. Because in 1981, during the civil war in Lebanon, where you refer to on page 16 of your thesis, I was part of the United Nations Interim Forces in the Lebanon, UNIFIL, as a conscript and a medical doctor. And as such, I regularly visited the small town of Nakura, where the UNIFIL headquarters is located, as well as small villages in the countryside like Kafra, Tibnin, Magdalzoon. I was struck by the dire circumstances people lived in, and I'm afraid that by now the living conditions have gotten even worse. I must say, thinking about the difficulties that your people has to cope with in all these years really hurts me. But on the positive side, you were able to perform high-quality research in Beirut, and this can be seen as a good omen. As to the content of your dissertation, I have two questions. First concerns the propositions that you have written in this extra sheet. In proposition number 1, you state that studies on the existing economic burden of MS in low and middle income countries are of questionable quality, I cite you. But then in proposition 3, you state that the economic burden in these very countries is huge, and the total cost per patient increase with MS severity. This wording seems to leave no room for doubt. So I wonder, how did you come to such a rather bold statement when the studies on which the statement is based, as I understand it, are of questionable quality? So is it a paradox or a contradiction? That I would like to have your thoughts about this. And my second question refers to the Euroqual measure you used. And you state it is a quality of life instrument. It is generally accepted, in my view, that quality of life can be defined as the functional effect of an illness upon a patient as perceived by the patient. Quality of life is multidimensional. It encompasses physical and occupational function, psychological and physical, and so on. So, the quality of life questionnaire aims to provide a comprehensive and a subjective measure of disease impact. The Euroqual is not broadly comprehensive, as it is restricted to 6 domains, and a disease like multiple sclerosis that may affect virtually every function of the human body and mind, this is rather limited and may not be suited to reflect the impact in every patient. And secondly, perhaps even more important, the Euroqual is not purely a subjective measure, because in order to generate the index, an external set of population-based values is used. And that, in my point of view, contradicts the notion of quality of life. And as to illustrate my point, if you look on page 191, you see figure 3, at the point of EDSS 6 and higher, there is a divergence between the line of the Euroqual and the music wall. And that, in my opinion, refers to the point that it is not both quality of life. One is quality of life, and the other is a utility score. So I would like to have your thoughts on this very particular aspect of your study. Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments. So to answer your first question about the propositions, so indeed, so studies are limited in low-middle income countries, and their quality is questionable. However, we were able to adjust the quality in our systematic review by first mapping all included studies based on the method of calculation, which is bottom-up versus top-down. Also, we recalculated the cost for some studies, either by EDSS level or overall, and we converted, we accounted for inflation, and we converted the final cost to purchasing power parity. So we strive somehow in order to enhance the comparability, and while we were enhancing the comparability, we were somehow, despite the heterogeneity of findings in low-middle income countries, to present some decent figure about the economic burden of multiple sclerosis that showed that multiple sclerosis is high as a burden. Despite that, still we can see some methodological differences and some ambiguous estimation of cost. Mm-hmm. So they might be contradicting, like both propositions, but at the same time, the economic burden of multiple sclerosis was found to be huge in low-middle income countries. Although they included studies, they didn't respect all kind of transparency when it comes to estimation of cost and the methodologies used for cost. So in case of a higher quality studies, definitely the burden will be higher than that. Yeah. So.
Well, yeah, the finding was not surprising, but nevertheless, I agree with your explanation. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And regarding the second question, so while we included, so while we assess the quality of life using the Eurocore, which is a generic instrument, this was completed with a musical instrument in order to tackle all the dimensions related to patients, and because of the musical is based on patients' perceptions and views when it comes to multiple sclerosis. We opted for the Eurocall first because it was used in the literature. For instance, there was a study by Gisela Cobalt al. That assessed the economic burden of multiple sclerosis in 16 European countries, including the Netherlands, and always she was using the Eurocall. So we wanted also to compare our study with the existing literature, but also we knew that this would not be sufficient. That's why we opted to complete the Eurocall with an MS-specific instrument.
Yes, I'm not against the Eurocall as such, but I wouldn't call it a quality of life scale. That's my point, rather. Okay. So, but we have a discussion later on about this. Thank you for your response. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Johan. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Petelos, public health specialist and ATH expert at Maastricht University. Dr. Petelos.
Thank you, esteemed Prorector. So first of all, congratulations, esteemed candidate, for the wonderful, very diligent work. This is a particular interest of me because I've worked in the past in submissions for cladribine, so it was fascinating to see so diligent work for settings that have great difficulty accessing disease-modifying therapies. In the interest of time, I want first to ask you about how relevant you find the recommendations you make across chapters, particularly Chapter 5, in terms of applying your recommendations not only in low and middle income countries, but across settings when you don't have only a financial crisis, but maybe other types of crisis situations. And I'm, of course, being a public health specialist, thinking of recent things we have been experiencing for climate change, for flooding, so transitional periods that may last months or even years and affect a particular region in shortages. Falsified medicines were mentioned, but also expired medicines and accessing different types of resources. So that would be my first question. Second question would be, and I'm going through them all now, but we can take it one at a time. Second question would be, this is fascinating work. How do you envision getting policymakers to engage in it, and whether you think their questions in terms of decision-making change at times of crisis, whether they change in particular settings. MS is a disease that affects double the number of women versus men, and you highlight that briefly in your thesis. Although there's not as much information as potentially I would have liked in the sampling. There's mention of EDSS in, I think, chapter 6, but not much there. And you also mention Iran in terms of potentially informal care being missed. So whether you have any recommendations for aspects that may not be able to be quantified or even qualified for other, beyond Lebanon, other settings. And finally, you mentioned in your data collection that you had at least 3 months pre-diagnosis, the 3-month collect, so 6 months diagnose, 3-month collect, which is very viable. But then again, you don't mention when they may have been diagnosed, and the progressive disease, you may have 75% of the patients have experienced cognitive decline, different degrees, but also they may be experiencing ill health of life, quality of life, or other aspects because of financial crisis, because of the particular situation in Lebanon. So were you able to differentiate in that? Do you want to look further into that? And how do you think of addressing the challenge at the time? And then a final aspect, if we have time, very briefly, you mentioned many times key informants and being very much involved in policy. Key informants are key. But you don't give, I think, maybe, or I missed it, you don't give enough information as far as I would have liked about how you identify them and how you approach them. And this is a practical guideline that you offer, so maybe this is also something to look at. Thank you very much. And my congratulations, apologies, to your supervisory group, of course. Thanks.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for the compliments. And to start with the first one about the valuation, the recommendation for valuation of cost. So certainly this was only addressed from the contextual factor of Lebanon and taking into consideration hyperinflation, which is a recurrent phenomena in low-middle income countries, but we couldn't accommodate for other reasons such as climate change or other factors that could be affecting our results in the future. And about like this recommendation, if they could be generalized, they could be generalized as long as they are taking into consideration the contextual factor. Because at the end, these are recommendations, general recommendations, but to adopt them, you need also to take into consideration the local contextual factors, including the cultural dimension, socioeconomic factors, but also the structure of the healthcare system, including accessibility for health. So that, yeah.
Sorry, accessibility, not access?
Yeah. Accessibility, yeah.
Okay, could you link that perhaps with the key informants at this point? So would that make a difference in identifying how you contextualize the setting? Would it be people you were looking into? Would it be culture? How would you go about identifying these aspects?
Yeah. So in the absence of a local data collection tool in Lebanon, so we got the permission to use the Gisela-Cobalt questionnaire, which was well used in the literature before. But however, it was adapted to the Lebanese healthcare system with key informant interviews. And how these were selected? So these were neurologists, clinicians working at the MS Center in Lebanon, in addition to health economic expert in Lebanon. And we have, unfortunately, we have a few health economics researchers in Lebanon, so it was easy to identify them, in addition to economic experts, in order to validate some data. And maybe economic experts were included as key informants when we collected or when we tried to estimate some costs in the absence of national costing data. For instance, when it comes to the average national wage or within the fluctuation of prices in Lebanon, like how we can come with the best scenario or best approach for costing methodologies and approach in Lebanon. And regarding there was a question regarding challenges that
Yes, you encountered in discussing with participants or collecting data from participants, because you had a lot of participants.
Participants with high cognitive, yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the recommendations to increase optimal data collection is to have data collected by a trained researcher. So for instance, in Lebanon, we knew that data collection through face-to-face interviews could be more costly and time-consuming compared to web-based collection tools. However, this was ideal for Lebanon and also suitable for low-middle income countries, as accessibility to internet and education could be major limitations, and at the same time, they resulted in a fewer missing answers. So the benefit outweighed the cost and time consumed by having a trained interview who will be structuring the question, having a structured questionnaire to guide participants, but by avoiding deceptive practices.
So I saw the purposive sampling, and I also saw the trained and trade-offs fine. This is fine. But then again, I looked at the population, and actually you have highly educated people in the population, if I saw correctly. Maybe 1/3 is men, so the prevalence across other jurisdictions is not necessarily there present. So I didn't see double number of women, for example, also highly educated. So in this respect, do you think that you managed to capture what we would say is a representative population for Lebanon, or the best you could have in the context of a purposive sample to have, let us say, not missing values in your calculation? Which of the two? The most representative population for Lebanon, or the population for which you could get the data?
Yeah, so the sample was representative because it was collected from, although it was collected from one center, but the center provide treatment to 1/3 of the Lebanese population from different governance based on a recent study on the prevalence of MS. And our findings, the characteristics of MS patients are consistent with the findings of the study on a study on the prevalence of MS that was published lately in Lebanon. So while our sample is representative, we cannot extrapolate our data without having the actual distribution of MS severity in Lebanon.
Okay, so this is fine, well understood. And then, of course, going back to the first question, which would be, how do you plan and how do you plan to continue the work, and also how do you plan to increase policy uptake for this? Because ultimately, even if you have the funds, the question is, I very much agree with your first observation. Sometimes middle income pay double than high income. Even high income poor pay double than high income rich. So how do you plan to continue with your work in terms of policy, and or to see how questions change from the policymakers in times of shortages, because that's where we are now, and in times also, of course, adapting to other policymakers in other jurisdictions beyond Lebanon? Thank you.
So,
Can your answer be short, please?
Yeah, I will. So regarding the policy, one of the generated recommendations from this dissertation is to implement HTA guidelines in Lebanon, and there is a team currently working on implementing HTA guidelines in Lebanon and doing that in collaboration with different stakeholders in Lebanon, but also with international stakeholders. Another point regarding the policy, our economic burden of illness study, it shed light or give indication about the actual burden of multiple sclerosis in Lebanon, which could raise the public attention and decision makers about the precise burden of MS. But still, there's a lot to be done in order to implement HTA guidelines within the Ministry of Public Health.
Thank you very, very much. And again, congratulations.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Petalos. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Drost. Assistant Professor of Health Economics at Maastricht University.
Thank you,
Dr.
Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, let me at least take the time to congratulate you and the team. It was a pleasure to read the thesis, and it's commendable that you contributed to the broader goal of standardizing health economic research in a country that has had relatively little history in this field. And here you are following the path of Dr. Risk, and hopefully there will be many more to follow in the region. Lebanon is not the only country with limited resources invested in health economics and HTA, and there's a lack of funding basically in every country. And in chapter 2, you conducted a literature search to find pharmacoeconomic guidelines in specifically low and middle income countries, as you indicated. And in your introduction, as part of the problem statement, you mentioned that our prior studies were incomplete. For example, you mentioned Carapinha only included 6 countries, Zhao only included guidelines published in English, Sharma failed to include a quite long list of countries. So basically you're building a case there and saying it's time for someone to be thorough and comprehensive and maybe even be more complete. And I looked at your PubMed and Medline search strings on page 56, and there you listed a long array of countries, including Tunisia, Iran, and many other countries. And you also consulted the ISPOR guidelines across the world webpage, which included quick links for those of Tunisia, Iran, and several other countries. These would be, I think, candidates also for your list of low and middle income countries, but you did not include them in the analysis, as I saw, even though maybe some relevant information can be found on the ISPOR website even itself. So I was wondering why it was limited to the 13 countries. Professor Groot already mentioned these, and I'd like to explore just to check whether you were methodologically comprehensive. So why were these countries and maybe some other countries also not included?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments. And regarding your question, so we were searching the latest version of formal economic evaluation guidelines. We completed our search strategy with a gray literature, where we look to the ISPOR, but also other websites in order to check like available guidelines. But then none included the guidelines because we're not completed or formal guidelines. And for the Iranian ISPOR chapter, like they were not accessible, so that's why we did not include them. And part of the hypothesis of this systematic review was to see the formal economic evaluation guidelines and explore similarities and differences in terms of study perspective, sensitivity analysis, uncertainties, and different methodological gaps to see like even available formal ones that are mandatory used. By the way, not all of them were mandatory used, but still to see how they are completed. And we found like just little studies were available, and there was a lot of methodological disparity and differences between studies included.
All right. So, because in the introduction, I think what I was expecting is that these others are not complete. Now I'm ready, and I'm checking. Probably in the results there will be a complete list. So there were 13. So if you then would compare basically your work to previous studies, what would be then the added value if you compare these to Carapinha, Zhao, and so forth, who do basically more or less the same thing of comparing the various guidelines.
Yeah.
And what would be the added value also for the reader, for the policymaker, compared to these previous studies?
So previous existing studies were limited to few countries, but not providing a comprehensive overview about low-middle income countries, all of them in general. And what will be important for Can I conclude my answer shortly? Yeah, and one of our recommendation was to tell international organization about the existing methodological gaps that could help them and guide low-middle income countries in developing their economic evaluation guidelines, but also improving the methodological framework, which is more important of the existing ones.
Thank you for the answer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Drost. Jalal Dahham, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return to this room. Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Professor Evers is authorized to confirm upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
That's great. By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Jalal Dahham, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by this by custom and law. As evidence of this, I'm now going to present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affiliated with the official seal of the Maastricht University.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Dr. Rana will talk to you on behalf of the supervisors.
Dear Jalal, dear Dr. Jalal Mahmoud Dahham, you have done it. The PhD project has come to an end, and it is my honor to deliver this Laudatio in recognition of your remarkable journey on behalf of your supervisory team, Professor Sylvia Evers, Dr. Michael Helixman, Dr. Ingrid Kramer, and myself. Today, we gather to celebrate an academic achievement, but also your remarkable resilience and unwavering determination. You are now officially the holder of a PhD in Health Technology Assessment from Maastricht University. Alf Mabruk, Dr. Dahham. I extend my congratulations to your wife, Lina, your daughter, Julie, your mother, Dr. Fadia, and your relatives and colleagues who are present here with us or joining online, and who I am sure share the same feelings of pride. Throughout the course of this PhD, you have faced a multitude of hurdles that tested your resolve in ways most of us can only imagine. Yet, you stood strong, unyielding in your pursuit of knowledge and dedicated to making a meaningful impact in the field of health economics, especially in low and middle income countries. Your journey, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, is a testament of your remarkable character. One of the most striking chapters in your PhD journey was your ability to execute your research in the face of a triple crisis that hit our country. The economic, political, and social turmoil that plagued Lebanon during this PhD tenure has deterred many from their academic pursuits. However, you channeled these challenges into opportunities, using them to sharpen your research focus, share what you have learned from this experience with other researchers, and deepen your commitment to laying infrastructure for HTA research in Lebanon. Throughout your journey, you have demonstrated a profound understanding of the economic intricacies of healthcare systems and the real-world impact of HTA. You are a self-driven, result-oriented researcher with excellent analytical and technical skills and a meticulous eye for detail. You are brilliantly able to present yourself both orally as well as written in a sound and strong manner. Dr. Dahham, you are a pioneer in this research field in Lebanon, and I am confident that your work will progress to bridge the gap between research and policy, as you discuss in your thesis. Congratulations, Dr. Dahham, on this outstanding achievement, and may your future endeavors be as bright as your soul is. You have not only earned a PhD today, but also our deepest admiration and respect. Your story is an inspiration to us all. And I just got a technical problem, so I'm sorry, I had a technical problem. So your story is an inspiration to us all and a reminder that excellence is forged not in the absence of obstacles, but in the relentless pursuit of one's goal. I will conclude this Laudatio with a quote that encapsulates what is etched in my mind about you. تجري الرياح كما تجري سفينتنا نحن الرياح ونحن البحر والسفن. The winds move as our ship runs. We are the winds, we are the sea and the ships. You did well, Jalal. The world needs more people like you. Thank you for this PhD journey that we walked together, and let's keep building beautiful things.
Dear Dr. Dahham, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree that you have required. I wish you a bright future, and hopefully you will be able to continue your academic work in the line that you have shown to us. I hereby close this academic ceremony. May I invite Dr. Salameh